This is a presentation. I'm not going to repeat what Deutsch says in his YouTube video. We're probably going to explore that as we progress. A lot of that in far greater detail, in fact, and some things that Deutsch didn't address in his YouTube video. But like I said, when I heard Deutsch give this presentation a couple of times, I was blown away. And it just occurred to me, why have I never heard this before? I mean, is Deutsch really crazy? Or is this just kind of a wacky theory? Well, it turns out that while Deutsch has preached about this extensively and in a compelling fashion, the question is he espousing just a wackadoodle theory? Is emphatically no. Absolutely emphatically no. And it turns out that for over 100 years, and probably quite a bit more than 100 years, biblical scholars have been advocating that Lazarus was the beloved disciple and or, in their different issues, the author of the fourth gospel. It's recognized even in a lot of mainstream materials that disagree with that premise. But for some reason, and this really is puzzling me, people just haven't heard about this. And the more I've read about just the extreme quantity, large quantity of material that discussed this theory, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that biblical scholars are a pretty insular and incestuous group. They write for each other, and it really doesn't get out to the public very often. And a lot of it is very derivative. They take each other's theories and they talk about it, and it's a wonderful dialogue, but it's about time that the rest of us really started to focus in on some of this, because apropos of Dwayne's question, it really is important. It really does make a difference. And I do think that this particular theory of late has gotten more and more and more attention, and it's really, the emphasis has increased significantly. So let's talk about the multitude of books that advocate that Lazarus was the beloved disciple. And I want to suggest that as the Minyan moves forward, if you're interested in pursuing this, we start by reading what I think is probably the best and certainly the most current and probably going to get the widest public attention, and that is this book. I think Diana mentioned that she had read part of this. It is a wonderful book. James Martin's book, Come Forth, The Promise of Jesus' Greatest Miracle. It's a bestseller, but it's just phenomenal. And it concludes a really detailed and compelling analysis of some of the things Deutsch talked about. But beyond that, Martin takes this story and this analysis and draws lessons from it for all of us. And I'll give you an example of that. He has a chapter about how wonderful it was that Jesus had a friend. Lazarus was his friend, his confidant, the disciple whom he loved. And from the context, it's pretty clear that Jesus had been visiting Martha and Mary and Lazarus more than just the chapter in the gospel. Otherwise, how could Jesus have already loved Lazarus? And indeed, when Martha and Mary contact Jesus, they say, "He whom you have loved is ill." They don't even identify his name. So that's just an example of the sort of things that Martin takes from this passage and applies to us, so we can do more than just study ancient text. It also includes a lot of his personal accounts of visiting the tomb of Lazarus, a lot of discussions about traditions concerning Lazarus in the Western and Eastern churches, which are extensive and they differ pretty radically, and also a lot about the art that's involved Lazarus, because Lazarus has been the topic for artists, writers, painters, sculptors, movie makers for years and years. Incidentally, this PowerPoint is going to be available for you all, so you don't have to take notes on all this. But here's a little link to a TikTok video that Martin recorded describing it, and I found it interesting in part because he is really just a warm and inviting speaker. I mean, it's some of these people who do this are kind of nerds. He is not. He is really good to listen to. So I encourage you to check out this TikTok video. He is also an extremely prominent person. Here are some of his credentials. He's a frequent national and international commentator on all kinds of media. He's written a ton of books, many of them bestsellers. He's the editor-in-large of American Magazine. He's a consultant to the Vatican, which gets me to something I'm going to mention in a second. But the book has gotten incredibly strong reviews, and here's just an example of some of them. I know Dwayne and I read one of Richard Rohr's book, but it has gotten universally glowing reviews. So I really, really commend it to you. John Starbert. When the last time Dwight made a presentation on this that I attended, John asked Dwight, how would the Archbishop of Canterbury react to this particular theory? And Dwight had an answer. In fact, Dwight, you had talked to Rowan Williams about this, and his answer was, well, the canon, the official word is that the Gospel of John was written by John, son of Zebedee, one of the 12. So that was a non-answer. Well, Martin published this book, Come Forth, and literally 3 weeks ago, the Pope released a letter praising the book extensively. And here's just a little passage from the Pope's letter. You can Google it and read the entire thing. It's extremely laudatory. Now, the Pope never expressly addresses Martin's conclusions that Lazarus was the beloved disciple and the primary source of the fourth gospel. But one would have to believe if the Pope thought this was a heretical theory, the Pope would probably not have written a letter endorsing the book. So I think this is really an indication of how this particular theory is getting a lot of traction and a lot of endorsement. And indeed, some of the scholars who've talked about it said one of the reasons this has come forth more recently is because the Vatican and those who are in the hierarchy of the church are much, much more receptive to looking afresh at the gospel and looking afresh at possibilities such as this, as opposed to just getting locked into the traditional approach. Martin's book also includes a really wonderful annotated bibliography that discusses other materials that have discussed this particular theory, including those that conclude that it's wrong. And I commend that to your attention. It's very balanced. And that's a source of a lot of the materials I've read in order to help me go forward with this also. And I really do hope that Martin's book, because it is getting more publicity and is more accessible, it's a far more readable book than most of these, may indeed increase the prominence of this particular approach and have people explore it, whether they're persuaded or not. It's certainly worth exploring and thinking about. All right, table of contents of what I want to talk about. And again, this is really just an introduction for the Minyan. This is not supposed to be exhaustive. I'm not going to go through in great detail all the reasons why Lazarus probably was the beloved disciple. But first I want to talk about why does this matter, then make sure we focus on 3 related but separate questions. Then finally give a quick overview of some of the books that we might want to read or not read, and some of the materials that argue the contrary view, because in fairness, we really ought to think about what the counter-arguments are. Okay. Dwayne, why does this matter? Well, like Dwight said, if Lazarus is the author of the Gospel of John or the beloved disciple or both, he's unique. He met Jesus in the flesh, was a good, close confidant of Jesus in the flesh, but also encountered Jesus in the great beyond. He encountered what Dwight has referred to as the cosmic Christ, and that is enormously important. And I think it in part explains what a lot of you talked about is really, really different. It's much more theological. It's just radically different. In the prologue, in the beginning was the Word, is just one of many illustrations of that. The quote I have on the bottom of this particular slide, I think, captures the thought very well. It's by one of the authors that we may read. The divinity of Christ shines through in the fourth gospel much more so than the synoptics, and it's perhaps because Lazarus had died and was resurrected. Second reason, if Lazarus was the beloved disciple and the author, the fourth gospel becomes a whole lot more understandable. It hangs together. It's coherent. And Deutsch will go on for hours if you ask him about this. But if the beloved disciple was Lazarus, that would explain why, first off, there are two suppers in John 12 and 13. First one, John 12, clearly says that it was at Lazarus' house. Next chapter talks about a supper, perhaps the same supper, perhaps the Last Supper. There's a lot of disagreement and discussion about this. But anywhere, this is the supper where the disciple whom Jesus loved reclined next to Jesus. And at least historically, that was a place of honor usually reserved for the host back at the time. And Peter defers to the beloved disciple to ask Jesus which one would betray him. And as Dwight has explained, that may make a lot of sense if the beloved disciple was Lazarus and had just been resurrected, had seen the other side. He had a position of real importance. So that may help that to hang together. Secondly, when Jesus was being questioned by the high priest after he was arrested and prior to the crucifixion, Peter and the beloved disciple go and get access to the high priest. And that's only provided because the high priest was familiar with the beloved disciple. And that would make a lot of sense for a Galilean fisherman or for the other of the 12 to have been known to the high priest. Lazarus, on the other hand, lived in Bethany, which was very close to Jerusalem. He was quite wealthy. He was well connected. And indeed, after Jesus brought Lazarus back from death, the high priest put a hit on Lazarus. So Lazarus was known, and Lazarus could indeed have probably provided access to the high priest. So that's another way in which it all hangs together much better if Lazarus was the beloved disciple. Third, while on the cross, Jesus entrusted the care of his mother to the beloved disciple. And a lot of the scholars say that may make sense if, in fact, the beloved disciple was Lazarus, because Lazarus was local. He could, in fact, take care of Mary. She could go to his place where she had probably been, Jesus had been many times before, and do so easily, as opposed to having to go to Galilee with one of the 12. And that also may explain why Mary was in Jerusalem at the time of the Pentecost. Fourth, Dwight likes to talk about how the beloved disciple was faster than Peter. He outran Peter to the tomb. And a number of the scholars say, that may make a whole lot of sense if Lazarus was the beloved disciple, because he knew the way. He was local. He knew Jerusalem. He knew where the tomb was. He may have known exactly where this place was. He may have known Joseph of Arimathea. Plus, having just been resurrected by Jesus, he probably understood what was going on when Mary Magdalene came back and told Peter and the beloved disciple that the tomb was empty. Light bulbs would go off for Lazarus, and he would be enthused and excited and run and probably outpace Peter. Fifth, the Bible, Gospel of John says that upon entering the tomb, Lazarus saw the folded linen and instantly believed. Instantly believed. Unlike Thomas, he didn't have to put his fingers in holes. He saw the folded linen. And that would make sense if Lazarus was the beloved disciple, because Lazarus had just been through a very similar experience himself. So that's a pretty strong and compelling reason. And the final one I want to mention is what Deutsch referred to before, this passage right at the end of the gospel, where it mentions that there were rumors that the beloved disciple would not die. Those rumors would make no sense whatsoever if they were applied to one or the other of the 12, or any of the 12. They would make eminent good sense if they were talking about Lazarus as the beloved disciple, because he'd already died once. Is he going to die again? And a lot of folks, including James Martin, believe this is probably the strongest and most compelling reason why Lazarus, in fact, was the beloved disciple. Whole different reason. Some of the scholars point out that the Gospel of John reads in kind of a funny fashion if Lazarus is not the beloved disciple. You go along and we have this lengthy, it's the longest single discussion in the Gospel of John about Lazarus's resurrection. And that seems to be a kind of an interruption. And then Lazarus disappears. And it just seemed to be kind of troubling to a lot of people as they read John. Why do we have this terrible disconnect, this big break? But if Lazarus is the beloved disciple, this makes eminent good sense, because Lazarus doesn't disappear. They just start to refer to him as the beloved disciple instead of by his personal name. And from this point on, the beloved disciple is one of the most central figures in the fourth gospel. Probably next to Jesus, probably the most significant in the balance of the fourth gospel. So it all again hangs together. It hangs together if Lazarus was the fourth disciple. And this is a point that's made by Floyd Filson, who wrote a piece in 1945 that if you saw the video Deutsch recorded, sort of the PR piece for this meeting, he makes this point and makes it very, very strongly and persuasively. Another reason why all this matters is the fourth gospel, or why it would make sense that Lazarus was the beloved disciple. The fourth gospel contains just a ton of detail. I remember in Bible studies with Dwight in the past, we've always talked about it. If you're in the Gospel of John, you're going to get some real specifics, like the paralyzed man was at the pools of Bethesda, not for approximately 20 years or approximately 40 years. It was 38. And when Jesus appeared to many of the disciples after the resurrection at Galilee, the disciples caught not about 100 fish or about 200 fish, they caught 153 fish. If the author of the fourth gospel was an eyewitness, the author could in fact provide this kind of detail. And providing detail of this sort often makes a story more credible. And so there's a lot of that in the fourth gospel. In the past, a lot of scholars and common readers, because the fourth gospel was so different, thought maybe it was just not historically accurate. It was more spiritual. It was with a lot of created stories as opposed to historically accurate. Well, it turns out that archaeology over the last 100 years, particularly over the last 50 years, has discovered a lot that has caused people to say, holy cow, the fourth gospel really does align very well with what we now know about ancient Jerusalem. For example, the pools of Bethesda are only in the fourth gospel, and people thought that they were fiction until archaeological studies in the late 19th century, I have late 18th, that's a mistake, discovered them. And holy cow, they align perfectly how they're described in the fourth gospel. The Dead Sea Scrolls also have discovered all sorts of things that are only in the fourth gospel that turn out to be factually accurate. And so very well may be that the fourth gospel is more historically accurate than the synoptics, at least in some respects. And so the tide has shifted as to the historic accuracy of the fourth gospel, which again would make sense if the author was a true eyewitness, and particularly an eyewitness who was based near Jerusalem. Similarly, the synoptics recount a one-year ministry of Jesus, largely focused in Galilee. The fourth gospel is really different. It has a 3-year ministry. It has time spent in Galilee, but probably the focus is on Jerusalem. And a lot of scholars think that is certainly a lot more credible. It seems a little bit odd that Jesus would only have a public ministry that lasted 1 year and wouldn't spend that much time in Jerusalem. The fourth gospel is different, and very well could be explained by the fact that it's written by somebody who was a disciple based in Judea. Which gets to a related point. If Lazarus was the beloved disciple and the author, the largely Judean perspective of the fourth gospel makes sense. And it may explain the differences between it and the synoptics, because the synoptics, most people think, were written by adherents of Peter or people who were in Galilee or who were not the Judeans. And so they have much more of a Galilean perspective. Lazarus, on the other hand, lived a couple miles, 2-3 miles from Jerusalem. The fourth gospel really doesn't give that much attention to the 12. In fact, only 7 of the 12 are even identified in the fourth gospel, and only often in passing. And there's only one mention in the fourth gospel of the fact that there were 12 disciples. That's in chapter 6, verse 67. But it talks a lot about other things, and things are going on in Judea. And if it is true that the fourth gospel was written by Lazarus, or any disciple based in Judea, that may make a lot of sense, and avoid the need to try to decide whether or not the fourth gospel is right or the synoptics are right. They just have different perspectives. They really, neither one, the author would write about what the author knew. And in the case of the fourth gospel, if that author was Lazarus, a lot of it's going to have a very strong Judean focus. And the fourth reason why, Dwayne, any of this matters is that it's really exciting. It's really exciting to study the Bible even 1,800 years after all this was canonized and come up with new insights. This really resonates with me. It makes the Bible come alive. It's just more real. It's tangible. It's understandable. And I at least find the historical context to be important. And it's a lot like visiting the Holy Land. Things are more tangible. And so that's another exciting reason why I think it's important to explore this path. Okay. As we start this journey, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are 3 very closely related but separate issues. First off, who was this disciple that Jesus loved? Second, who was the author of the fourth gospel? And third, what do we mean by the author of the fourth gospel? Because you can get tangled up in your underwear, and you have all kinds of arguments if you mean the person who actually sat down and put quill to papyrus. May mean that, may not. Okay, let's start off with who was the beloved disciple? Why is that important? Well, it's important because the beloved disciple was a really, really major figure in the fourth gospel. And here's some examples. A lot of them we talked about before. One we didn't talk about before is the fact that the beloved disciple was there at the crucifixion. Something that, thank you, Lucia, set up. That is really, really substantial. Hard to imagine an event that's a whole lot more significant than that. And among the major disciples of Jesus, only Lazarus and the 2 Marys, 3 Marys, I guess, were there at the crucifixion. So the beloved disciple is a major figure, and whether or not it's Lazarus or whether or not it's the Lazarus or the beloved disciple is the author of the gospel, the beloved disciple is an important person, so it makes a lot of sense to spend time and give the beloved disciple a lot of attention. Now, mainstream tradition identifies the beloved disciple and the author as John, son of Zebedee. That's what you probably were taught in Sunday school. That's what the organized religion has typically adopted. And when you argue that Lazarus was the beloved disciple, you're going to attract some people who say that is absolutely heretical. You're nuts, and you're violating fundamental principles of my religion. Well, it turns out that the reason why the fourth gospel was identified as written by John is probably because about 190, there were a number of historians and church leaders who said that. And that's 100 years, about 100 years after the gospel itself was written. And if you look at what they wrote at the time, the context wasn't even who wrote the fourth gospel. They were arguing about what's the right calendar, trying to decide when Easter occurred. And so it was almost in passing that it was written by John. But moreover, these are not contemporaneous statements. And the gospel itself never identifies its author as John. And that's true also for the three epistles ascribed to John. There is what some people call a superscript or a tag that says it's the gospel according to John. That very, very likely was added again in the late second century. So a long time after the gospel itself was written. The trend, very, very strong trend among biblical scholars, is that the fourth gospel was not written by John, son of Zebedee. And there are a whole slew of reasons why they've reached that conclusion. And the books and articles we're hopefully going to look at and we can talk about further can go off in great, great detail. But just let me give you one example. Virtually none of the things, none of the events that are discussed in the synoptics where John, son of Zebedee, was prominently involved, such as the Transfiguration, none of them are discussed in the fourth gospel. I mean, and it's just mind-boggling then that John, son of Zebedee, would be the author. Plus the fact that John, son of Zebedee, was a Galilean fisherman who would not be familiar with Jerusalem and Judea, and it just doesn't line up with the Judean focus of the fourth gospel. So why on earth, historically, back to the late second century, was the fourth gospel ascribed to John the Apostle? The prevailing view among biblical scholars is because Gnostics really loved the fourth gospel, and they were viewed as heretical. And the mainstream church, Rome, wanted to bring the fourth gospel back into the mainstream. And by attributing it to one of the 12, that helped enormously. Helped really enormously, gave it credibility. Sure helped to get books canonized, the Gospels canonized, if you could tie them to one of the 12. And in addition, John was a really common name, and some of the writings in the late second century, or even the early second century, are very confused about who they're talking about. What John it is, John, son of Zebedee, or maybe John of Patmos, or there are a couple of other Johns that are floating around that we'll probably talk about. So part of it may just be pure confusion as to why historically the fourth gospel was ascribed to John, son of Zebedee. So what does the fourth gospel say itself about who wrote it? This is the passage that Deutsch read. And it says, "This is the disciple who has testified to these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true." And that follows immediately after Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved. So the natural reading of this is that the gospel itself tells you that the disciple who Jesus loved is the author. And that's a common sense reading of what the gospel says. And that's how most scholars interpret it. It's not a lead pipe cinch, you got to admit, because they use the amorphous pronoun, "this is the disciple," and while it's a line or two after identifying the disciple whom Jesus loved, it's possible that this means this is the person who's writing it, even if that person's not the beloved disciple. That's a possible interpretation. Otherwise the discussion's over. The gospel tells you that it's the disciple whom Jesus loved who's the author. That's not the only place the fourth gospel tells you who the author is. When Jesus was being crucified, Mary, mother of Jesus, Mary, wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene were at the cross. And John 19:34-35 says that the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, and blood and water came out. And paren, he who saw this has testified, so that you may believe, so that you know, so that you also may believe. And his testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth. Again, identifying that the beloved disciple is probably, if not the author, at least the source of what's recounted in the fourth gospel. And there are a lot of other reasons why it would make sense that the author of the fourth gospel was a Judean follower of Jesus, and that Lazarus was the follower. It's just a natural reading, textual arguments, the kind of things that our current Supreme Court finds compelling. There's a textual case that's really, really strong, that it's Lazarus and the beloved disciple. Like I said a couple times before, there's a strong Judean influence in the fourth gospel. And the beloved disciple was an eyewitness. And like I said before, also just the omission from a lot of things that would make sense if the gospel was written by by John, son of Zebedee, or one of the other 12. Now, John 21:24 is written in the third person. It says, "This is the disciple." So whoever wrote John 21:24 didn't say, I am the beloved disciple, or I did this. They're saying the beloved disciple is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know his testimony is true. And most scholars believe that John 21, the last chapter, is an addendum that was added after the gospel first appeared, but added shortly, not in the late 2nd century, but shortly after the gospel appeared. And they based that on the scrolls they found and the like. So this may indicate that the earlier passages were written by the beloved disciple, and the addendum was written by somebody else, perhaps a follower in the Johannine school. Same thing with John 19:35. It's written in the third person. John 21:24 says that the beloved disciple has written these things. And what does that mean? Does that mean that the beloved disciple actually took a quill and put it on papyrus? Not necessarily. And if you go back to the original Greek, it turns out that the word grospos means either wrote yourself or caused to be written. And that's indeed the same Greek word that's used when it's mentioned that Pontius Pilate wrote the inscription on the cross about King of the Jews. Pontius Pilate himself probably didn't go out and write that on the cross. Pontius Pilate had his minions go out and write that. Well, the same principle applies here. It's entirely possible, indeed probable, that Lazarus, or the beloved disciple, was the source of a lot of what's in the fourth gospel, if not everything that's in the fourth gospel, but one of the followers, the Johannine school, was the person who either wrote it down or took maybe an early draft that Lazarus may have in fact written, or the beloved disciple actually wrote, and edited it, put it together. And indeed, really the concept of author is something that we get hung up on that's not consistent with how people viewed what an author was in ancient times. For example, we refer to it as the gospel according to John, or according to Matthew. It doesn't mean that John necessarily sat down and wrote it, or Lazarus, whoever it was, but it's according to the source. And there are a lot of indications in the fourth gospel that it went through a number of truly major edits. There are chronological and geographic gaps. Here's some examples, like the healing the crippled man at the pools of Bethesda, just kind of inserted between some Galilean stories and then jumps back to Judea. John 20 reads like it's the end of the gospel, and then we have chapter 21. So scholars, biblical scholars, are pretty clear that there was some editing going on, and that very well could have been done by somebody named John, or somebody else. So the prevailing view is that there were a lot of edits and redactions, and they were probably done by somebody in the Johannine community of the early church, and the beloved disciple might have been a leader of that. The beloved disciple may have been an oral source that the editor, the scribe, wrote down, or perhaps there were others who were involved. So I don't think that makes a whole lot of difference, quite frankly. If Lazarus, or the beloved disciple, was the source of this and somebody else wrote it down, I mean, that is a good question. Why does that matter? It probably doesn't. doesn't, except for people who are really biblical scholars and get hung up on a lot of this. We are at 10:02, and I could go on for a goodly while more, and probably will, but it undoubtedly makes sense to pause here and give people a chance. I would really strongly recommend you get your hands on James Martin's book and read it, and then we reconvene at a later meeting.